Okay, this is a brief review of Chapter 5 for Criminal Justice 340, Concepts, Operationalization, and Measurement. So in this chapter, we're going to go through understanding the role of concepts as summary devices for bringing together observations and experiences that have something in common. So I'm going to explain how concepts are mental images that don't exist in the real world, but we have to operationalize them and specify concrete empirical procedures for measuring those variables. So operationalization begins with our study design, but it continues throughout your research. And so another thing we're going to talk about today in this lecture as well is why measurement categories must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive, as well as how to distinguish different levels of measurement and the properties of those different levels. So we're also going to talk about precision, reliability, and validity, which we talked about a little bit before, but in this case as dimensions of measurement quality, and summarize how creating specific reliable measures may not reflect the actual complexity of the concepts that we're trying to study, right? And some of the issues there with, validity. So also we're going to talk about different composite measures and their advantages. Okay, so let's jump in. So because measurement is difficult and imprecise, researchers try to describe the measurement process explicitly. So ultimately, criminal justice and social science research seeks to communicate findings to an audience. Sometimes the audience is professors, or maybe students, or someone who's reading professional journal articles, those journal readers. Or it could be people who work within different agencies within the criminal justice system, such as working in a probation service agency or something like that. So who our audience is also does kind of matter in the way that we construct our research, but typically, at least for the purpose of this class, we're going to understand how people structure research for the journal article design, right? So a big part of coming up with, kind of narrowing down our scope and being able to operationalize and measure starts with moving from vague ideas and interest to a completed research report, right? So we start with our vague ideas of, this might be related to this, but how do we then produce research based on those kind of concepts we're coming up with in our mind, right? So when we have more precise definitions, we begin to develop measures that then we can apply in the real world to kind of see whether or not the relationship between our vague idea concepts are actually happening. Right? Okay, so when it comes to starting this process, clarifying abstract mental images is an essential first step in our measurement, right? So, okay, let me skip the crime part for a second. I'll come back to that in a second. So, conception, right? This is, it's not the other kind, right? It's a subject that, it's basically a subjective thought about the way that we encounter life. So, it's almost like a perception, right? It's kind of like your take. So when it comes to conceptions, they're subjective, meaning they're based on our own viewpoints and perspectives, right? So they can't be communicated directly because we're not, telepathic, right? So we use words and symbols. Of course, language being the most complicated symbol that we use in our daily lives, as a way to communicate about our conceptions and the things that we observe that are related to those conceptions, right? But this is where it gets trickier, because meanings of words are also interpretable. And this is why, I'm just going to hammer this nail in the whole time. This is part of the whole thing of becoming more specific, is we've talked about previously the importance of replicability in research, in being able to look at the research findings, see whether or not they make logical sense, and then be able to replicate that research in either the same way or a different way, whatever it might be. So if you're not being specific about the ways that you're measuring specific things, then it's not something that's going to be easy to kind of, go over and replicate, or just be able to kind of discern the overall validity of, right? So for example, crime. Crime is an abstract concept. What does crime mean? Well, we could talk about this in the criminological sense, right? There are many theories that talk about what is crime, what is, determined as a crime. So if you think of it from kind of a deviance perspective, right, corresponds with what we consider to be right and wrong in the culture, meaning our norms and values. So that could be one definition, right? Crime could be, at least for a specific definition, it could be breaking a codified law, right? So laws are typically just our norms that we've then put into law, right? Such as, stealing is bad is a cultural belief. And so then we've ensconced that into law. So there are criminal, punishments for breaking those laws. So how do we define crime? Is crime only when you get caught and processed and booked and convicted and sentenced? Or is crime just, breaking a codified law? Or is it something that has to be intentional, right? Meaning, is it not considered a crime if you didn't know the law, right? So again, there's no right or wrong. It's just the idea that something as vague as crime has a billion interpretable ways to understand it based on our own positionality. So when you want to measure crime within a research study, you have to be pretty specific about how you're going to do that, what you're looking at, and, basically move from that conceptualization of crime, which at least is your take on what it is you're trying to focus on, that then you can operationalize. So if you're only looking at crime as something that is like codified into law and involves people who are actually convicted, right, then the kind of measures you would use are going to be different than if it's something that crime is every single time that someone violates that particular law. Because spoiler, there's a lot of people that get away with crimes, right? Like, for example, think about speeding, right? Something as innocuous as speeding on the freeway is a crime. As much as if we were only documenting the crime as the people who were caught speeding, got a ticket, etc., then we're missing the fact that a lot of people speed on the freeway. If so, it's a lot of people get away with it more than they get caught for it, right? So certain crimes, that's going to be the distinction. And again, crime as a category is so huge, it'd be very difficult to tackle. Typically, you'd be looking at different kinds of crimes, right? Like we know violent crimes have very different patterns than property crimes or, kind of the person-to-person stuff. So how we even define these things is integral to what we're actually measuring, right? So that's why we have to be really clear about what is it we mean by crime. And again, it's abstract. There's no right or wrong. It's just a measure of, how we come up with it, how we conceptualize it within our own research. So again, concepts are just the words or symbols in the language that we use to represent our mental images. So we use concepts to communicate with one another so that we can share those images in our minds. But again, we're limited by the structure of language and by the interpretation of language being different between people. This is why we have to be incredibly specific when doing research, right? So concepts are abstract because they're independent of the label that's assigned to them, such as with crime, right? It's the meaning we put on it as a culture is what it means to commit a crime. And again, we know that a lot of these things are very socially constructed, meaning they change over time, that, our conceptions of what crime is now might be very different than it was before. So we have to be clear and not just say, I'm going to measure crime, right? Okay, well, what do you mean by crime? First, you would define it as a concept, then you would operationalize that concept. Okay, moving on. So there are 3 classes of things that scientists measure, right? First, you have direct observables, indirect observables, and then constructs. So for the first one that scientists measure is direct observables. So those are the things that we can observe and simply, kind of document. So, and we'll talk about different research study designs more in depth later on, but we know that this also relates to different kinds of research studies, right? Like obviously a direct observable, we talk about participant observation or observational research like ethnographies, or maybe experimental research that are very direct. And then you have, of course, indirect, where you're asking people their opinions like surveys or maybe kind of self-reported information, or, asking them what their preferences are, what their beliefs are, things that they do, things like that. And then, of course, the construct itself we'll talk about too are those things that we've created. So we can't really observe them, but They might have like a social meaning, right? So that's also obviously going to affect the kind of specific methodology you choose to address those questions. So anyway, let's go back to direct observables. These are like the most obvious, right? So let's say what you're trying to observe is crime reports, and you're looking through crime reports for, let's say, certain patterns, right? Let's say a certain kind of victimization that keeps coming up in crime reports, right? So the observable thing itself is the crime report, right? Versus an indirect would be something that's more subtle, or the observation you're making is indirect of like a particular group or individual. So this could be, finding out criminal history of a particular, the past actions of a particular person in a case, or maybe, like court transcripts. That's used a lot in kind of more legal side of the criminal justice system research, right? Where you're not sitting in court watching it transpire as you would if it was a direct observable. As an indirect observable, you're just, reading the transcript of what happened, and using that as the thing that you're observing, and, basically developing understandings and patterns from that data, right? So it could also be, let's say a story in the paper, like in the newspaper or magazine or something like that, where it's kind of a third party to you. Like you're reading someone's interview, but you didn't interview them. And the interview wasn't a part of your research. It was done, to pre-exist that research, right? And again, constructs are a little bit different. These are a little more complicated. So constructs are theoretical creations that are based on things we can't observe directly or indirectly, really. So a big one that's come up, at least within the past, within criminological understandings, was the IQ test, right? There were understandings, and again, this is like, we could get super into that if we had more time to talk criminology, but the underpinnings of which were incredibly racist, obviously, but there's kind of an interesting history with the IQ and how it was used for purposes of criminality and also really deportation, kind of social valuing of people. So in a time period where we accepted the notions of eugenics, right, this kind of time period where because of white supremacy making its way into the social definitions of our culture, there was this kind of movement across all of the Western world to embrace this idea of good genes, bad genes, good breeding, all this kind of stuff, which was like a very, not subtle racist way to kind of promote whiteness. So anywho, during this time period, there were some kind of misinterpretations of the IQ, at least within the United States. The IQ itself was created by Binet, I believe it was France. I'm tired. But anyway, and the original thing with the IQ test was that it was a baseline measure that could then be improved, right? So like, let's say at the beginning of the class, I give you all an IQ test, and then by the end of the class, maybe we can get those points up a couple points, right? Based on the interventions. And so the whole point of creating the IQ test was to say, okay, well, these students are testing low in this particular, like let's say math or English or whatever it might be. So we will give them more help within that particular, like give them tutoring for that particular, not weakness, but maybe just place where they need improvement, right? And that can then help kind of refine and really raise their IQ. So the IQ test, though, here in the US, this was interpreted through a eugenicist logic that said that if people had low IQ scores, they shouldn't be able to have children. And this motivated sterilization campaigns of people for being quote-unquote feeble-minded, right? And again, no one's taking into account the idea that the IQ can change, or that intelligence is not just a matter of, knowing things or a capability of it. It's the fact that if you don't give people formalized education, they're not going to know things, right? Anyway, I mean, it seems so obvious to us now, right? Like, let's say if you don't have books readily available in your life and you don't have anyone that's literate to teach you how to read, then you won't know how to read. You could be the smartest person in the world, but you're not going to be able to read without that kind of instruction, right? Without that knowledge. So that wasn't really factored into these IQ tests as well. The idea was your IQ was set for life, and if you tested low, they use it as a reason. They deported, tens of thousands of people based on the idea that they had low IQs. And not to mention the fact that many people were taking IQ tests that were written in English when English wasn't their first language. So that's a whole nother problem. But again, it's coming from a very eugenicist, racist logic, saying that there are inherently inferior and superior people, right? So we had a lot of theories of crime related to IQs as well, meaning that if people had lower IQs, then they were more likely to commit crime. And there are certain studies that have made these relationships clear, at least within very specific dimensions, right? But it's not applicable to everyone. You can't just say, well, this person has a low IQ, so therefore they're going to go kill people, or they're going to go, commit property crimes, or something that reductional. It's much more complicated than that, right? But we do know there is a relationship between kind of low self-control and low IQ. So there's, theories within criminology, we talk about lack of self-control can lead to a lot of issues of crime, right? But anyway, getting back to the whole three classes argument here, the whole thing of having a construct of an IQ as a measure of criminality is something that had to be challenged over time. It took a while. And what's actually interesting is the dude here in the US who said, no, it's fixed at birth, it stays that way forever, he eventually was like, maybe it changes. But by that point, they had already used it as a way to determine who got to be in the country or not, who was sterilized, who, in some cases, who ended up in prison. And what's interesting is the only thing that made him change his understanding about it was they tested people that were going into war and found that consistently lower IQs than was expected. And so, again, you're talking about people in their late teens. So it kind of got to the researcher to be like, oh, well, maybe there is a change. It's evident there. So again, when we look at constructs like the IQ, sometimes these things take on a life of their own. They become ensconced in the culture as, either a way to determine immigration status, as a way to, kind of factor in likelihood for criminality, things of this nature. And it's harder to then kind of question a lot of these constructs. We're going to talk about more of our more modern day constructs later on in the class, but it can be difficult to test our hypotheses about these kind of constructs, right? Because you can't observe it directly or indirectly, but it's still a force in something that has an impact on society, so therefore can have a large impact on criminality or crime. So again, that's just one example, but when it comes to these kind of classes, it's really just what we're trying to look at, depending on, the kind of, whether or not we have something we can observe or something that's much more kind of social. Okay, so conceptualization is where we specify precisely what we mean when we use a particular term, right? So there's indicators and dimensions to conceptualization. So the end product of conceptualization process is the specification of a set of indicators. So basically what we have in mind, indicating the presence or absence of the concept that we're studying. So part of this, again, the dimension aspect is the technical term for the groupings that we come up with, right? So a specifiable aspect of that concept. And this is really where we specify the different dimensions of a concept, which can give us a more sophisticated understanding of what we're looking at. Right? So I put an example here on the slide because I think sometimes indicators and dimensions can be complicated, right? So this one is looking at 3 dimensions of poverty, right? Health, education, and living standard. And then you see, like, to go along with the specific dimensions of the concept that are groupings, meaning they are mutually exclusive. Like health is different from education, is different from living standard. Right? Obviously, they're related in 3 ways to poverty. But then you have these particular indicators that are going to, kind of specify the dimensions of what you're looking at. So you have nutrition, child mortality as indicators of health. You have years of schooling and school attendance as indicators of education. And then you have cooking fuel, improved sanitation, safe drinking water, electricity, flooring, and assets to indicators of living standards. So it's basically that you would take something like poverty, which is a crazy, abstract, vague concept, and make it more specific so you can explain what it is you're looking at. So in this case, looking at these 3 specific dimensions and these 10 indicators. So sometimes our concepts are derived from the conceptions that summarize collections of seemingly related observations and experiences. So this can cause confusion over the definitions that we are making, right? And, versus the reality that we're living in. So although observations and experiences are real, all of our concepts are just mental creations. And the terms that are associated with those concepts are really just devices that we use to communicate with each other. So we have to really push past this trap we can fall into, that believing that, terms have inherent meanings, when really, just open a dictionary and you'll see that most words have multiple definitions, meaning they're already very interpretable. And so we can't assume that when someone sees the word, let's say crime or poverty in this particular incident here, that means that they will interpret it the exact same way. Of course not, right? We are subjective beings. We're going to interpret things in the way that relate to our own lives. So if we've mistakenly assumed that terms have real meanings, then we're going to try and discover what the real meanings are and measure those, and that's not something that's going to be replicable, because what is quote unquote real to us might be different to someone else. So that's where the reification comes in, or basically the process of regarding real things that are not. And so we have to guard against the potential for kind of giving a concept life when really it's just a word, a symbol that we put meaning to. So you have to be clear about what meaning are you putting towards it and what is it, right? Okay, moving on to creating conceptual order. So the design and execution of criminal justice research requires that we clear away confusion over concepts and reality. So logicians and scientists distinguish 3 kinds of definitions. So you have real, conceptual definitions, and operational. So you have real is just a statement of the essential nature or essential attributes of some entity, right? And again, for a lot of the concepts we're talking about, there is no real, right? It's something that's very socially determined, something that's socially constructed in our modern time period, meaning the definition of that particular concept would not be the same 100 years ago, and it would not be the same in a different culture, right? So we have to be really cognizant of how that works and make sure that we're guarding against kind of giving these things life that they don't have. So a conceptual definition is a working definition, right? That you're basically the definition you are picking for your term. So let's say you open the dictionary and there's, 3 definitions of your word. The one you pick is your conceptual definition, right? So specification of conceptual definitions does 2 different important things. First, it serves as a specific working definition, like I said, that presents itself to readers so that when readers read the research manuscript, they can understand what it is you're trying to study, what your concept is actually trying to measure. And it also focuses your observational strategy, meaning if you're more specific in the conceptualization, it'll be easier to turn that conceptualization into an operational thing that you can measure, right? But if you're still kind of vague and all over the place, you're not going to have that same specificity that's going to lead to a clear operational definition, right? So it's not that the conceptual definition directly produces observations, but it channels the efforts to develop actual measures, right, when you're being specific. So then operational is just spelling out precisely how the concept will be measured, or, a description of the operations that you're going to take to measure that specific concept, right? And we're going to keep going over this. So hopefully if you don't understand it right away, this is something, we're going to keep beating that dead horse until you do understand. Okay. Okay, so operationalization choices. So when you're moving from, you have your concept, you have your definition of crime, right? How do you then measure that crime? That's the operationalization. So you have to describe how you will obtain an actual empirical measure in any research study. That's kind of the whole point, right? So to do that, you need to go through this operationalization process. So the research process is not usually a set of steps that proceed in order from first to last in the way that we're often taught it is in a textbook. It's much more a complex thing, and sometimes operationalization kind of goes back and forth with conceptualization. As you reconceptualize things, you then have to change the operational understanding. So it's a little bit more nuanced or back and forth there. So developing an operational definition moves us closer to measurement, right? So this requires that we think about selecting data as well as, how are we going to collect that data? Not just how do we define this, but how would we go about answering our research questions? So when it comes to measurement as scoring, operationalization involves describing how actual measures will be made. And obviously, once you describe, okay, here's how I'm going to make those measures, the next obvious step is to make those measures. So measurement itself is distinct from operationalization. Measurement involves actually making observations and assigning scores, right? Or maybe numbers or other labels to whatever it is you're observing, versus operationalization, which is then just specifying how you would get that information in the first place or how you would measure it. So many people consider measurement to be the most important and the most difficult phase of criminal justice research. So many basic concepts in criminal justice are not easy to define, right? Especially not as easy as we would like them to be. So it makes sense that there's going to be a lot of different conceptualizations, which lead to then different operationalizations. So different operationalization choices produce different results. So if I'm looking at crime as something codified into law, and you're looking at crime as any time someone violates a particular law, and even if they're, I'm looking at only people that were convicted of a crime, and you're looking at people who just committed the crime, then the way we operationalize that's going to be very different because we conceptualized it differently, right? So different operationalization choices produce different results. And so it's important, if we want science to be replicable, that we're clear about how these things work, so that if I'm looking at your research study, I would have an opportunity to replicate that. Okay, so moving on to exhaustive and exclusive measurement. So every variable needs to have two important qualities. First, it should be exhaustive. And so this just means that it's described in full measure, right? That the variable has to be classified in terms of its attributes, right? Of how it's related. So again, attributes are just the characteristic or qualities of a particular variable, right? So that has to be fully exhaustively explained, right? What does it mean and how does that work? And, otherwise the variable is not going to be very useful in research because we're not going to be able to measure it very clearly. And then the second part is attributes that are part of a variable have to be mutually exclusive. So meaning researchers have to be able to classify every observation in terms of one and only one attribute. So meaning, let's say I'm going to use a variable like gender, right? Then if I'm going to use gender, I want to make sure that I'm exhaustive and not just use terms like male, female, that's it, right? Because we know that gender is more complicated than just male or female. So you'd want it to be exhaustive, meaning I would want categorical choices like, cis male, cis female, trans, non-binary, or even really a prefer not to state, right? And so then once it's exhaustive, you have to think to yourself, are your categories you're offering as options, are they mutually exclusive? So meaning there's a concrete kind of social difference of the understanding between those particular categories. Meaning if I ask you your gender, you're not going to say, well, I'm both this and that, right? You're going to pick one of those choices because they're mutually exclusive, right? So hopefully that makes sense. The idea is that whenever you're creating categories, it has to be something that actually encapsulates what you're looking at exhaustively, but it also has to be something that gives categories that are different enough that it's easy to say, okay, you're this one, not that one, right? And again, with more complicated research studies, sometimes you're talking about a variable that has various different categories. So they have to be very clearly exclusive, right? At least that way is a better way to measure them, right? So you wouldn't want a category where I'd say, what is your gender, and I say cisgender or transgender, and those are the two options, because cisgender can then also mean male and female. So again, it's not mutually exclusive enough, and it's not exhaustive enough because you're not giving enough categories of expression. Just in the same way, if you only said male and female, you're not giving full categories of expression to folks that don't fit on a binary spectrum, right? Anywho, before I start talking about gender for longer, I was like, this is supposed to be a short lecture. Okay, anyway. Okay, so let's go to levels of measurement. This one could be complicated for folks, so I want to go through this a little bit. So first, levels of measurement tell us what sorts of information we can gain from the scores that we've assigned to values of a variable. So there's different kinds of levels of measurement, and I think the easiest example of this would be this image. Because I love all the visual learners out there. I always want to give you some sort of visual image. And the reason it has these arrows, I just want to point out before we jump into it, is because each one builds upon the next. So meaning this one, all the qualities that you find in nominal are also found in ordinal. And then all the things you find in nominal and ordinal are also in interval. And then all the things that are in all three are also in ratio. Right? So this is kind of the gold standard. This is especially for quantitative research. If you want something that's replicable, that you can apply to larger populations, you want ratio. But for some studies, nominal or ordinal is all you're going to get, especially in a qualitative sense, and when you're looking at things more categorically, right? And not in a numerical sense. So we'll talk about the different ones, but again, I think the most important takeaway is that they build upon. So meaning everything that's true about this is also true about this, but this has a different dimension of it being ordinal. That's also true about interval, but interval's different than these two, etc. Right? So each one adds another dimension. Okay, now that I've rambled. So nominal measures are variables whose attributes have only the characteristic of exhaustiveness and mutual exclusiveness. So again, going back to the gender example. Gender is not something that's necessarily numerical, right? It's also not something that has like a logical rank order to it. So, nominal basically is just it's in a category, right? And then we split up that category definitionally to measure it. So another nominal variable could be race, or maybe what city you live in, right? The major you have in college, that would be nominal. Your political party affiliation would be nominal. Again, it's not like we can rank it as like, well, here's the best one and here's lower and then here's the lowest one, right? It would just be different categories, right? So depending on your political party affiliation. Let's see, it could also be marital status, right? There's no ordinal or, numerical factor to marital status. You're either just categorical, meaning you could be single, you could be married, you could be widowed, you could be divorced, right? These are exclusive, exhaustive categories, but there's no like rank order to them or hierarchical or numerical part of it, right? So we just basically are offering names or labels for stuff in nominal, right? Okay, so ordinal is variables whose attributes may be logically rank ordered, right? So basically things that have some kind of like low, middle, top, right? So let's say like occupational status, that could be an example. You have like the lowest spot on the ladder of an occupation, right? Like the entry level. You have the people that are like the middle management, and then you have the people that are like the CEOs or something like that. That could be an example of ordinal data, that you have this kind of like lower is the the person that's on the ground, middle management, and then you have the CEO. So that's ordinal as an example. But of course, in criminological research, we're really looking at this more of like things such as things that already have rank orders. So for example, the police themselves could be an example of this. Like there's very specific levels, right, to where people, as an occupational status, like where people end up. So that could be something that's measured differently. Like you could see, like for instance, we know issues of police brutality are in the news quite a bit. So if we were researching that from the perspective of trying to understand the dimensions of how this is happening, why this is happening in some police departments, we could then look at, in a kind of ordinal sense, well, who are the people that are doing this? Are they the rank and file? Are they middle management? Are they people that are, higher up in the organization? Things like that. That could be, an ordinal interpretation of that data. But I mean, obviously a lot of research really looks at fear of crime as ordinal, right? Meaning that you can have a low fear of crime, a kind of moderate fear of crime, or a high fear of crime, right? Or even just like how serious you think crime is as a social problem could be something we could measure in a way like this, where you could say like, oh, I don't really think it's that big a deal. It's like a low, or I think it's kind of a big deal. And then like, I think it's a very big deal, right? So that would be ordinal. So if we know which groups individuals are in, we can determine that one has more or less than another. That's going to help us in this kind of ordinal ranking way to understand what the data is we're looking at. So again, everything that's a nominal and ordinal is also an interval. So it's still mutually exclusive categories. It still has a logical rank order, but interval also has the actual distance that separates the attributes in a specific way. So meaning the logical distance between attributes can be expressed in a standard interval. So that's why it's called interval, right? Again, nominal because it's like name categories. Ordinal because it's literally like the ordered rank. Interval because we can actually measure set intervals between those things, right? So you can't necessarily say that there's a set interval between ranks of police officers or something like that, right? But you can say there is a classic example of interval data would be weather, right? Temperature, right? Meaning that we know that the difference between it being 89 degrees and 90 degrees is a set interval. It's 1 degree. And that will be the same between 90 and 91 degrees, between 91 and 92 degrees, even though it feels worse. The hotter it gets, like the more I'm like, is it 20 degrees hotter? But there is a set interval in between, meaning you have like that particular, whether it's temperature, whether it's anything else, you have a set interval in between the things that you're measuring on that kind of ordinal rank, if that makes sense, right? So if you have like cold temperatures as the low end, high temperatures as the high end, you still have this kind of ordinal sense to it, but it's interval because it has very set intervals in between those categories, right? So in this case, temperature as like expressed by each degree. Well, at least in our country, Fahrenheit, right? Not really anywhere else in the world because we're weird like that. So criminal justice researchers often combine individual nominal and ordinal measures to produce a composite interval measure. And then moving on to ratio, again, everything in here and here and here is also in ratio. The only real difference between interval and ratio is a true 0 point, right? So an example would be age. There's a point in which you don't exist and then you do, right? So there's a true 0 point for that, right? Or let's say, within the context of the criminal justice system, if we're looking at property crimes, dollar values, right? It could be property crime is $0, or it could be thousands of dollars. And remember, within the criminal justice system, we determine these crimes and their weight really for property crimes based on the dollar value of property loss. Once you've hit a certain standard, you get to different legal liability standards, right? Depending on how much money there was damage of. So anyway, that's one ratio example as well, because you can go from 0 to whatever the value is. Another criminal justice example of a ratio measure could be your number of prior arrests, because you could be arrested 0 previous times or multiple previous times. But again, it's a set interval standard, right? As you're saying, how many times? 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, right? Blood alcohol content is another ratio data that we use a lot, especially when it comes to understanding drunk driving. So again, there's a there's a true zero point of just like there's no blood alcohol content, right? So, and then of course another one given by the book is length of incarceration as another one, because there is a 0 point. You could just be incarcerated 0 days, or you could be incarcerated for years. So again, the idea is that each one builds upon itself, right? And so everything that's in here has these elements, but sometimes research, you can only use certain variables are only going to be nominal, or only going to lend themselves to ordinal, or interval, or ratio. So again, we have to understand the differences between these so that we can understand the kind of applicability of the differences in our research. So some of the implications for the different levels of measurement is that some variables represent different levels of measurement, as we talked about, but also different statistical techniques require variables that meet certain minimum levels of measurement. Meaning, again, ratio is the highest level. So if you want something, that's the most statistically relevant, you're going to try and aim for something that's ratio. But a variable can represent multiple levels of measurement, right? And it really matters of how you conceptualize it as to how it will be operationalized and then measured. So, you can basically use variables in different ways, but some variables are just going to lend themselves to certain kind of measurement. The analytic uses planned for a given variable should determine the level of measurement that you're looking for. And of course, you should realize that some variables are just going to be limited because you can't study them, or you can't measure them in a true zero sense, right? So you just have to be cognizant of that when you're researching these things, and applying that to what then particular measures you use and statistical methods you might use to interpret the data you collect. So if a variable is to be used in a variety of ways that require different levels of measurement, then the study should be designed to achieve that level, right? So you can't convert a lower level measure to a higher level one, right? It's if you're starting with nominal, you can't then turn it to ratio. But ratio is going to encapsulate everything below it, right? Okay, so some criteria for measurement quality. I know we've talked a little bit about reliability and validity before, but guess what? We're just going to keep talking about it. Okay, so the key standards for measurement quality are reliability and validity. As a general rule, precise measures are superior to imprecise ones, but precision is not always necessary or desirable depending on the kind of research study you're doing or the topic that you're approaching. The two technical considerations you always have to pay attention to are reliability and validity, but many criminal justice measures are imprecise. So reporting approximate values is often preferable because you're not going to be able to get all of them, right? We talked about the dark nature of crime, or the kind of idea that sometimes we don't catch everyone. So it means that there's certain elements of data that we might be missing. So it's better to use approximate values than to just be like, well, I don't know the exact values, I'm not going to do the research, right? So, we'll go through these a little bit real briefly, as we've talked about these a bit before already, reliability and validity, but just kind of at least within the context of measurement, right? So reliability is just a matter of whether a particular measure is actually going to yield the same result if you do this particular measure multiple times, right? So if you do the same research study over and over, are you going to get the same results, right? And so reliability is just the ability to kind of get the same thing over and over. So measurement reliability is roughly the same as measurement consistency or stability. So it doesn't ensure accuracy any more than precision does, because there's no way to control observer subjectivity. This is, again, why we use research methods in the first place, is because we're very subjective beings, and we often will just kind of reify our own biases as real unless we use kind of more strict measures to check ourselves against, right? So there are a lot of techniques that are developed to deal with reliability because, we're people and there's problems, we can make mistakes, basically. So first one is called test-retest method. So this can be appropriate to make the same measurement more than once, and if answers vary, then the measurement method, to the extent of that variation, is unreliable. So although this can be useful to have a reliability check, though, it is limited in some respects, meaning sometimes people could just have a bad memory, and that's why their responses end up being inconsistent. Or sometimes because they're doing a retest, they've already done the other test, so their first answer affects their second answer, right? So again, but overall, it can be a good way to kind of just give us an idea about the reliability of what we're doing. And this is something we'll talk about later, especially when we talk about surveys, is oftentimes what we'll do is have a kind of a small test of a survey to test for the reliability and validity. And then we go back and kind of edit things a little bit based on what we found out about the reliability issues or validity issues. And then we actually give out the survey. That way you're not like testing it out the first time when you're giving it out the first time, because if there's confusion or maybe the people reading it don't understand what you mean by that particular question or things like that just need to be refined so you get better kind of clearer answers. That often happens through that test-retest method. There's also what's called inter-rater reliability. So it's common that, there might be some respondents that get additional contact after the research just as a way to kind of check the reliability. So let's say you had people giving a survey or something, and you have their contact information and you reach out to them after, and just a subsample, not every single person, but just a small sample of the people that were already in the research study, just to verify select information that they said, okay, so when you answered B on this part, did you mean this? Things like that. Again, just to kind of make sure that what you think you're measuring is what you're actually measuring, right? Because if everyone's answering B and your interpretation of B is wrong, it's not going to produce any kind of reliable information. So one way to increase consistency in when you're looking at something that's like a source document, like let's say official records or something like that, or the crime reports we were talking about before, is coding. So coding is this process where you basically divide what you're finding in those particular reports into categories, kind of like what we were talking about before with categorically mutually exclusive things, that you then try to see what patterns are popping out. Like, many of these kind of respondents that have had contact with the criminal justice system had this particular factor that was related to that. Or, whatever it might be, you code when you're looking through the records, because those codes are just patterns that you notice that then become your data. So the thing that makes this more complicated is that, let's say we're doing a big research study and we're looking at like all the cases for, criminalization of marijuana, let's say, for example, from the 1996 crime bill through, the year 2000, right? That would take forever. And as a result, there'd probably be a bunch of researchers. And so when there's more than one researcher, you have to be really clear about coding, because maybe the way you would code something is different than the way I would code something. So that's like another measure that has to be really consistently, looked at, is how do you make sure that each person that's looking at the code is finding the same thing. So they do this often by, using kind of a sample of records and comparing all the coders against that sample. And if they get basically the same thing, if each person is making very consistent decisions about the coding, great, then you're doing great. But that's a big point at which there can be some conflict, or again, the subjectivity of our own values or bias can get into even the way that we code things. So we have to be really clear and careful about how we do these things and make sure that every person that's doing that particular research study themselves is also looking at these things in the same way. And that's very difficult to do, right? So that's why we have these reliability checks. On the last one that the book talks about is the split half method. So making more than one measurement of any subtle or complex social concept, let's say you're trying to measure fear of crime, right? Then maybe measure it in more than one way. Because if one of the indicators is wrong, or one of the particular measures you're using isn't as reliable as it should be, then having multiple ways of measuring that particular concept might really help at least provide more reliability to the idea that what you're seeing in your results is actually measuring what's happening within that variable that you're actually studying, right? So validity is a little bit different. Validity is saying that the measure adequately reflects the meaning of the concept that's under consideration, right? So that validity is that you've operationalized better. So if you have high reliability, that just means you're going to hit around the same spot of the dartboard or the bullseye, whatever it is, the arrows that you're shooting, I guess, or I guess darts is kind of more common than arrows, but you get what I'm saying. If you're aiming for the bullseye, but you're not hitting the bullseye, but you're consistently hitting like the top right corner, you have high reliability, but you have low validity because you're trying to aim for the center of that bullseye, right? So validity is hitting the center of the bullseye, but also you need reliability and validity to actually make sense, meaning if you do this over and over, you're going to get the same result, not just it was a fluke that you happened to hit the bullseye and the rest of the time what you find is scattered around the board, right? So both of these things are integral to making sure that what we are looking at in the research findings are actually valid, right? Or actually are related to what you were researching. So we talk about validity. One of the ways that we deal with this is, basically measurement validity, which is whether you're really measuring what you say you're measuring. And this is more difficult to demonstrate than, individual measures are valid. It's harder to say that what you're measuring is also valid. So every level of which the research design happens, we have to kind of come back to reliability and validity and build this into the design process. So there's numbers of ways of dealing with the issue of validity. First would be face validity, which is just empirical measures when you're doing them may or may not kind of jive with what's the common agreement or the accepted social understanding of a particular concept. So if it on its face it doesn't make sense, then there's a problem right there, right? There's also what we call criterion related validity. So this is comparing a measure with some external criteria. So a measure can be validated by showing that it predicts scores on another measure that's generally accepted as valid. So sometimes we refer to this as convergent validity. So maybe you're using a similar scale or a similar tool used in a previous research study and you find similar things, then that can be something you adapt for your own research, right? Another kind of version of this is what's called discriminant validity, meaning the measure of a concept that's different from the measures of similar but distinct concepts. So measures can discriminate and they can give you different concepts, right? So you have to be clear about, again, going all the way back to the conceptualization. What is crime, right? Okay, so you've conceptualized crime in a specific way. How can you then measure that? Is your operationalization. Okay, you've been able to operationalize. Now, how are you then able to measure and make sure that that is both reliable and valid to what your original concept was actually trying to measure, right? It's it's a mouthful. But that's kind of how complicated these things end up being, right? But again, it's so important you put this effort in on the front end because then you don't have to deal with it the same way on the back end, right? When you're dealing with research findings that are just not applicable. So construct validity is another issue. So construct validity is based on the logical relationship among the variables that you're researching. And tests of construct validity can offer a weight of evidence that our measures either does or doesn't, kind of tap the quality that we're trying to measure without providing definitive proof. So tests of construct validity are less compelling than tests of criterion validity, but it's still a valid measure to help us, a valid measure. It's still a way that we can make sure that what we're looking at is valid. And there's disagreement about which kind of tests should be done in different situations. So that even causes more subjectivity and conflict, right? But it's less important to distinguish the two types than to understand the logic of validation that they have in common, which is that if we're successful in measuring some variable, then the measurements should relate to other measures in some logical fashion, right? That's all they're trying to say there. And then last, there's content validity. So this is the degree to which a measure covers the range of meanings included within that concept. So again, concepts are complicated and they all have these kind of meanings attached to them. So how much are you measuring crime, right? How much are you measuring the range of meanings associated with that concept, or at least the way you've conceptualized it? So sometimes the way to deal with this is what we call multiple measures, or comparing an individual measure with alternate measures of the same concept. So this is, again, similar to establishing that criterion validity, but a little bit different because you're looking more about how each individual measure looks at the same concept. Let's move on to composite measures. Okay, so composite measures are combining individual measures to produce more valid and reliable indicators. So this is frequently used in criminal justice research for a few reasons, right? The first is just that researchers are often unable to develop single indicators of complex concepts. The world is too complex to be able to measure it in just one individual way. And this is especially true in regard to attitudes and opinions that are often measured through surveys, right? There's going to be a lot of variety there. Another reason that criminal justice research uses composite measures, or combining individual measures, is that single data items might not have enough categories to provide the desired range of variation. So we'll talk a lot more too about indexes or scales that are formed from several items, and how that is going to give you different information than something that's just a single variable. So indexes and scales are efficient devices for data analysis because several indicators can be summarized in a single numerical score, even while very nearly maintaining the specific details of all the individual indicators. You can still find the representation. If your index and scale, again, itself is reliable and valid, then you can find very precise measures that you can interpret statistically, that are going to obviously net good information for you. So we're going to talk, I know you're like, great, but we will talk a bit more in depth later on about indexes and measures and scales and typologies and all this fun stuff. But this is just kind of like putting our foot, putting our toes in that pool at this point, right? So what you really need to know now for indexes and scales is just that they're efficient ways that we organize data. And so right now we're talking about setting up measurement, but when we talk about data collection, we're going to talk much more about indexes and scales. So anywho, typologies are combining variables in different ways to produce different composite measures. So sometimes we call this a taxonomy instead of a typology, same diff, right? So typologies are produced by the intersection of two or more variables that create a set of categories or types. And so, the book gives this example of, an index of disorder, right? That kind of gets into the dimensions of this stuff. But a typology is just a classification of observations in terms of their attributes. So, again, typologies are typically created with nominal variables. So, for example, a typology of thieves might group them according to the types of cars they steal, or maybe the type of locations that they search to find targets, right? That would be an example of a typology. So again, how does this connect back to reliability and validity? So again, reliability is the quality of the measurement standard, basically where the data that's collected reflects the observations of the same phenomenon. So let's say the question is, did you see a police officer in your neighborhood today? That you would have, a certain reliability of that would be different than how many times in the past 6 months have you seen a police officer in your neighborhood, right? Because with the reliability of that, meaning we talked about how sometimes people can be confused, or maybe they haven't kept in mind how many times in the last 6 months, versus did you see a police officer today, is going to be more reliable because people can remember today, hopefully, right? And then again, validity, going back to that too. The validity is whether statements about cause and effect are true, or of course valid, or false or invalid, right? So, for example, if police records of auto theft are more valid measures than police records of shoplifting, right? We need to know, what are we looking at? Are the records that we're keeping, are these actually reflective of the people committing these crimes and how they commit these crimes? Again, because our research, we want to make sure that we're actually finding what we want to find, right? What we're trying to measure. So it's important to realize that the ultimate validity of a measure can never really be proved. We just have to agree that its relative validity has, on the basis of its face validity, criterion related validity, content validity, construct validity. So basically, we can't ever say that it's completely valid. We can just say that, well, we checked all the boxes of the different kinds of validity throughout the research design process.